Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, October 16th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look back at that internal Republican polling memo that was leaked to Politico, done by the Senate Leadership Fund, who conducted swing state polls in their battleground Senate races that showed abysmal results for the Republican Party in what was honestly quite promising results in terms of polling data for Democrats in races they honestly didn't expect to be quite competitive or quite as beneficial for the Democrats. Now, you might remember I did a video on this 2 days ago talking about what this poll actually had said and what it meant for the current state of the race and how it was telling us the Democrats were in a better position than they otherwise thought, especially from the perspective of Democrats who do believe they are down in some battleground states where they probably are running quite even and if not ahead across these battlegrounds. Now, Republicans have made it a point to note out that a lot of these races that Democrats are running in, they have gotten to a point where they are in a competitive position or competitive territory. For instance, they mentioned states like Pennsylvania, where Dave McCormick is within 2 points according to their polls. Keep in mind, these are all Republican internals, and that what that means for us is that the Republican internal likely skews a little bit more towards the right, which is why these numbers were actually much better news for the Democratic Party than they otherwise thought. They talk about how they're pulling ahead in the state of Montana, taking Jon Tester and making him unpopular. They talked about how in Ohio, they're driving down Sherrod Brown's support from 50% and they're tightening up Wisconsin. But what really stuck out to me, given this was a Republican internal, was the acknowledgement of two races, Nebraska and Texas, where they say in Nebraska that a serious trouble spot has emerged as Senator Deb Fischer, the Republican, is in a tight race with Dan Osborne. Now, I've already talked about Texas. I made a video on it yesterday, talking about how this race in Nebraska is doing quite well for the independent candidate. But what also stuck out to me wasn't just Nebraska. I said there were two states. It was also Texas, where they actually did some polling in the state, finding that Representative Colin Allred crept up on Ted Cruz by heavily outspending him for weeks. Now, this is how you always preface a poll memo to your donors. This is how you always preface and say, he's being outspent, da-da-da-da, right? All of these things to say that you should not be shocked by what the data tells us. But let's go ahead and explore some of that data, because honestly, you would be quite shocked if you were a Republican from 2012. Because what they have found here is that Ted Cruz's lead was 3 points back in mid-September. A mid-September advantage. Donald Trump had a smaller lead over Harris compared to where he is now. 4-point lead on the presidential, 3-point lead on the Senate level. None of these numbers were ever released, by the way. None of these things were ever publicized. This memo was never meant to get out to the public. Politico only got it because somebody, one of the top people out there who received these data points, decided to leak it to Politico. And what they have found in Texas is nothing short of an emergency for the Republican Party, not only for this election, but for elections moving forward, finding that Senator Ted Cruz, the Republican, is ahead by just one singular percentage point in a Republican internal, led by a polling firm in conjunction with the Republican Senate Leadership Fund, Super PAC. You are finding that this Texas race here is quite good for the Democrats when you're looking at it alone. And they talk about in the polling notes, beginning in early August, Colin Allred has been heavily outspending Ted Cruz on TV. Well, get what was just announced by Democrats recently as late as September, not early August, like when they say this is all beginning for Colin Allred, but September 30th, Democrats invested and announced that they were now going to be putting money in Colin Allred's Texas Senate race because of the increasingly closer race. And that is what's going to benefit Colin Allred in the final stretch of the campaign. But again, look to this point. Looking at it in Texas, GOP outside groups, including a dedicated Cruz Super PAC, joined in the fray late September and narrowed Allred's spending advantage. But the damage clearly had already been done. And they said they're carefully monitoring media placements and will have fresh polling numbers next week. So they likely have new data that they can tell us for October. It's not going to be leaked again. Maybe it will be, depending on how these numbers look good or bad. But all we know, based on what we are seeing, is Republicans are absolutely ringing these alarm bells. They're running to the top of the tower. They're screaming at the top of their lungs, Texas is competitive, Texas is competitive. And it's a very different story than what was told back in 2018 when they promised and they swore Ted Cruz was not in competitive Senate race. I remember all the discourse around the Texas Senate race. And we genuinely thought, even on this channel, that Ted Cruz had no way in which he lost the race. That ended up being true. But even beyond that point, there was no way and no circumstance Texas was this battleground state as everybody was trying to claim it was. And Republicans, too, were adamant. They were looking at the polling numbers. In the final stretch of the campaign, the A-plus pollster, the New York Times and Siena College, they said Cruz led by 8 right before the election. Quinnipiac University said Ted Cruz led by 9. CBS News and YouGov said Ted Cruz led by 6. Emerson College said Ted Cruz led by 5. And the problem here was that because these data points were so strong for Ted Cruz, nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted to poll it after October 10th. So what happened? The race did in fact narrow. And Ted Cruz not only came in a position where he underperformed 7 points, he only won in Texas in 2018 by a margin of 2.6%, giving Beto O'Rourke the best performance for a Democrat when it comes down to competitive races, in fact, being the closest Senate race in Texas since 1978. A very strong showing for Representative O'Rourke at the time, no longer in Congress, but a very, very strong showing. And that 2018 result was an indicator that Texas does have reason to ring the alarm bells, that Republicans should be worried about Ted Cruz, but they adopted a similar mindset in 2024. Early on, they said there's no way Texas is competitive because the data looked so good for Ted Cruz earlier on. You can see that in the early stages of the campaign, going back way before the general election season, the idea here was that Ted Cruz was going to be fine. When you take a look at some of these numbers, right? Marist College, Ted Cruz led by 6. Signal said that Ted Cruz led by 9, right? You were seeing number points here. Low points were Cruz plus 5. You saw Cruz plus 10, Cruz plus 13. Good numbers for the Republican Party, Cruz plus 11. But then we got closer to the general election, and it narrowed, and it narrowed, and it narrowed, and we got a shocker from Morning Consult with Allred in a lead by 1. Republicans realized right at the end of September, holy crap, we need to invest more. But now they're ringing them even higher after last night's Texas debate. Why? Because the general notion from the media and from viewers is that Colin Allred won that debate. Now, I'm not here to claim that that debate is something that every voter tunes into, because they don't. Not every voter is listening in or watching this in or making this, something that's part of what they consider to be how they vote in the election. Not everyone has the time to this. I do think, though, when we're looking at the 2024 election, for 2018, in comparison, I don't even know what that was for. 2018 comparison to 2024, there's a lot more money on both sides. There's a lot more money on both sides. Colin Allred is being matched, at bare minimum, matched if not outspent by the Republican Party. And so I think that is something that is going to be a major playing point here. I still think this election will be closer than 2018. And I think the data points, too, sort of indicate that what we have known in Texas politics is that in that final stretch between October 1st and November, whenever the election is, in 2020, you saw a different date than 2016. So really, all around here, Democrats start to shore up support. And I think after last night's debate, I think after all these different things that have been happening in favor of Colin Allred, you are going to find some pretty good results for Democrats on election night. Not to say they're going to win. I still don't think that Democrats are going to win the Senate race here, but it is a lot likelier than it was 6 months ago, and a much better position. And you can see this too on the Senate forecasting odds. You can see this was a race to the White House. Unfortunately, 538 doesn't have this release, but when you look at a state like Texas, you can see that the trend line here has been pretty strong for Democrats and honestly quite consistent. You can look in the state, Ted Cruz has maintained, right, roughly a 70% chance of victory, but at different points it had been higher, right? You had seen at different points it was 83%. When we had started out earlier on, there weren't many data points to look at, but it has in fact narrowed since then. And the margin and projection of, Ted Cruz's advantage at one point was supposed to be 11 points, and today is down to 4.4%. That's a good thing for the Democratic Party in a state that they're likely going to be investing tens of millions of dollars in for many, many years to go. And so looking at the 2024 cycle, Texas might not have been that race that was going to determine it all from the beginning. And I do think that it's a lot likelier to being that tipping point state, if it even is a tipping point state at all. Republicans still have a massive, massive chance at winning Senate control, just given how lopsided this map is for the Democratic Party. But you cannot ignore the very, very real concerns that Republicans are having in their investments in states like Texas, trying to match it. You're seeing that after this debate, Ted Cruz is out there spending tens of millions of dollars to win this race. Nobody would have thought 12 years ago that Texas was going to be this battleground state, but here we are today, where Texas is in a much better position for Democrats, a much more competitive one, and really something that Ted Cruz has been trying to say since January that Republicans are just now picking up on. And I think that's really going to be the killer here for Republicans should they lose this race, is that this race was easily foreseeable as one of the closest of the cycle, despite it being in Texas and despite the numbers not looking good for Biden earlier on. They looked a lot better for Harris, and in results, they look a lot better for Colin Allred. And I will be shocked, honestly, though, if Colin Elwood wins this election. But I do say, and I do see it, not everyone is in agreement that this race is going to be a clean sweep for the Republicans, that this race is going to be an easy one. At most, they have a likely red characterization. When you look back at these ratings back in 2018, sure, you saw some very similar things, but the expectations here were a lot higher up until the final stretch of the campaign. All of these moves were made in the late stages of the campaign. Earlier on, you can track it even too on Wikipedia. When this race started out, the expectation and the standard was that this race was safe. What Colin Elwood has done is replicated Beto O'Rourke, and likely done so in a way that could be even better, given that the data points were so far off in 2018 in comparison to what the actual results were. 2.6% versus a 7-point average, that's a massive swing. And it's a swing of nearly 5 points across the state. And I hate to say it for Republicans, but when you're looking at the 2024 cycle, a swing like that narrows Texas to being less than a 1% victory. And that really is something that the Republican Party should be genuinely terrified. Because if it isn't Ted Cruz, it's the next Republican running for Senate. It's the next Republican running for governor. When you take out Greg Abbott and John Cornyn and you no longer have these incumbents who hold a relatively high popularity, you're running out of options to win in competitive states, winning across the country. And I think that really is something that is quite interesting at bare minimum, and something Republicans are going to likely have to reflect on when you're spending, so much money in a state with 20 plus media markets and millions upon millions of people, for Senate races, governor races, presidential race, where in years past it had never even been that competitive. And so we'll see if Democrats have any states similar to Texas. The problem for Republicans, too, is that the Electoral College map in its expansion and shifting towards the party right now is something that, towards the Democratic Party is something they will have to inevitably confront. When you're looking at the states that have now become more competitive on the national level, they aren't there yet. But think about it. For instance, right? Texas is a state, 83% chance of victory there for Trump. Colorado is 97% chance for Harris. If Colorado is a state that Democrats can rely on more than Republicans can rely on Texas, that becomes a major problem. 2020 was foreshadowing that because it resulted in Joe Biden winning Colorado by 14 points, Donald Trump won Texas by 6. It was telling us that that might be the new norm, but Republicans again swore, especially this race, that it would not be the same, that Donald Trump would make a play for Colorado. He just campaigned in Colorado. He's making a play for Minnesota. He's making a play for Virginia. He's making a play for New Hampshire. They promised that these states, all of the ones I have mentioned so far, voted more for Biden than Trump won Texas by. All of the states I mentioned, Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Maine, all of these states that Donald Trump swears this time he's going to make competitive. And looking at the numbers, Minnesota, more for Harris than than Texas is for Trump. Virginia, more for Harris than Trump has in Texas. Maine, same thing. New Hampshire, same thing. Colorado, same thing. New Mexico, same thing. And when you look at that, and you give Democrats that baseline, potentially 225, 226 electoral votes, because you look at Nebraska second, again, same thing. More for Harris in Nebraska second than more for Trump in Texas. That's the problem for Donald Trump, because when Texas goes into the fray of being that competitive state, it no longer becomes this 40 electoral vote victory that Republicans can rely on to skyrocket and bolster their numbers. Is it a state they will likely win for the next few elections? Probably. But is it a state that Democrats will also likely win at some point in the next few elections? Absolutely. And that's going to be a major problem for the GOP. And I think Ted Cruz is just the beginning this cycle, because 2018 did indicate a shift. And it resulted in a shift in 2020. It resulted even a shift in 2022 when Greg Abbott got the smallest margin of victory he has ever had in a Texas governor's race. And in those down ballot races weren't looking too hot for Republicans either. And so looking at 2024 and beyond, Texas could be this sleeper state in the presidential, in the Senate level, in a way that Democrats could not have foreseen before, but is becoming much more obvious, or Republicans could not have seen before, becoming much more obvious as we get more data, get more information, just overall understand more about Texas than we did, and would put us in a circumstance where Texas might be one of those more closely watched states, similar to that of Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania, which would make it quite interesting and honestly a much more fun election if we had much more populous states being so competitive that could make or break the chances for a political party. In this case for Republicans, the moment they lose Texas, their party collapses, and their pathways to victory become that much smaller, if not almost entirely impossible, given the electoral math, and maybe just then, they'll support an amendment to strip the Electoral College of its power and shift to a popular vote margin. But we'll wait and see on that. All speculative, just food for thought. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.